I've been asked to talk about what our cities will look like in the year 2021. Well, the future of the city already exists. It's not Masdar City, the walled eco-city currently being built in Abu Dhabi, where sheikhs and technocrats cruise around in electric personal transit pods. Nor is it Chengdu, where the Chinese government is building the master-planned Great City District, whose apartment towers will include the first mile-high, actually kilometer-high building. Nor is it Medellin, or Freiburg, or Portland, or any of the dozen or so poster children for sustainable urbanism that usually get trotted out. The city of the future is present in one form or another in the cities that we already live in. Because, as Italo Calvino observed in his great book, Invisible Cities, a city can contain multitudes of other cities, for better and for worse. You can find swaths of Manhattan-style density in Calgary, favelas out of Rio in the public parks of Tokyo, canals straight out of Venice and Los Angeles, and McMansions torn from the excerpts of Atlanta on the outskirts of Beijing. In the same way, the city of the future is not a single space, but a way of managing and planning space. And it is a city that is within the grasp of every city on the planet. But first, what do we mean when we talk about cities? According to some definitions, urbanity is nothing more than proximity. Cities, proposes Ed Glazer in the book The Triumph of the City, are the absence of physical space between buildings and companies. Now, that's a pretty reductive definition. He is, after all, an economist. But he's hit on a deep truth. There's something about so many lives and passions and ideas brought into close proximity that creates the ferment that in turn creates civilization. Without Rome, there would be no Bernini or Michelangelo or Fellini. Without Tokyo, no Kabuki or Otsu or Murakami. Without New York, no Gershwin or Great Gatsby or Martha Graham. Cities not only foster civilization, cities are also one of the greatest products of civilization. Standing alongside expressionist cinema, the plays of Shakespeare, and improvised jazz are the bridges and canals of a water city like Suzhou, the serpentine hilltop streets of Siena, and the skyscraper canyons of Chicago's Loop. The city, when it is done well, counts among humanity's greatest masterpieces. Which is why it is incumbent on us as a species to get cities right. Building them well encourages civility, which is not only the tolerance of, but also the delight in, complexity. And complexity is a sine qua non of any truly robust society. Now, more than ever, we need to think hard about the future of cities, because the future of the world is undeniably urban. In China, there are already 169 cities with populations of over 1 million. Half the Earth's population now lives in cities. By 2050, the proportion will be closer to 3/4. What's more, the rate is accelerating. The Earth's cities now grow by 1.5 million people a week, which means a city with the population of New York is added to the planet every 2 months. In 7 years, the Earth's population will have increased by 500 million people, the Earth's urban population, and by mid-century, it will reach 6.4 billion. Managing this growth will be the great challenge of the 21st century. If we get cities right, if we build human communities that foster harmony, prosperity, and civilization, we've gone a long way to getting the future of the species right. Right now, we are blowing it badly. In North America, we spent much of the 20th century blowing apart the traditional city. Partly to blame was the modernist ideology that called for the separation of functions, dividing our cities into zones of commerce, residence, and employment, malls, suburbs, and office parks, separated by vast expanses of asphalt. Partly to blame were government policies that undermined urban neighborhoods and made it all too easy to opt for a house in the burbs, accessible by freeway and off-ramp. Mostly to blame, though, was the private automobile, a machine that ingeniously appeals to the atomistic desire for autonomy while having the effect of the atom bomb on traditional communities. The damage in the form of urban freeways, ex- and suburban sprawl can seem extensive and irreparable. Let's put it into perspective, though. The drift into decentralization and automobile-driven sprawl, the city that Lewis Mumford called the anti-city, which annihilates the city wherever it collides with, is a recent post-war phenomenon. Urban history goes back to at least 7,000 BC, when Neolithic artisans gathered together in the settlement of Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey, which is why I try to get not too discouraged about the fate of our cities. The walking city predates the automobile city by a good 9 millennia. Time is on its side. The simple fact is that private automobiles are no longer a credible transportation system for our cities. Congestion costs the Toronto region at least $6 billion a year. Some studies put it closer to $11 billion in wasted time and fuel. Transport Canada estimates that collisions alone cost the Canadian economy $63 billion. If you throw in air pollution, carbon emissions, and delays from traffic congestion, cars cost our economy another $27 billion a year. And what do we get for that $90 billion? Aggravation. Toronto and Montreal now suffer some of the longest journeys to work of any major cities in North America and Europe. Commuters in our two largest cities spend almost 80 minutes a day fighting traffic. As a bonus, we're paying through the nose to kill ourselves. Our chosen transportation technology, the automobile, kills 2,000 to 3,000 people a year in Canada and at 1.3 million people around the world. In the few minutes that I've been talking to you, 12 people have had their lives cut short by cars. In the next 7 years, the cities that continue to take the North American metropolis as the inspiration for their urbanism and the private automobile as a basic unit of mobility will be economically crippled by gridlock. Many are already there. Lagos, with its 24-hour traffic jams, Jakarta, with its impossible tangles of jeeps and jitneys, Beijing, with its endless orbital roads, Hyderabad, with its trucks and auto rickshaws that drive people off sidewalks. All of these cities have opted for the asphalt path, and all are paying a heavy price in terms of pollution and congestion. In contrast, the cities that are limiting traffic are already experiencing the benefits. London has poured revenue from its congestion charge into improving its bus network, turning the city center into a place where getting around on bicycle and foot can be a pleasure. 20 French cities, from Strasbourg to Brest, have introduced networks of modern, low-floor streetcars that have revived once traffic-ridden city centers. Bogota, once a byword for urban violence, kicked cars off its sidewalks and plazas and introduced a heavy-hauling bus rapid transit system that operates like a subway on the street. Transmilenio, as it is known, has revolutionized mobility that was once limited to a tiny elite, and the mayor who introduced it, Enrique Peñalosa, is now running a popular campaign for the presidency of Colombia. And best of luck to Enrique. The election's in 2 days. In short, the walking city, a city enabled by mass transit, is the city of the future. Walking, that primordial activity that defines us as bipeds, fosters health, sidewalk contacts, creativity. But managing even 10,000 steps a day, a minimum for good health, can be difficult given the current car-centered configuration of our metropolises. There is no pleasure, no relaxation to be had in strolling through endless surface parking lots or trying to cross stroads, those horrible urban thoroughfares that don't know whether they are streets or roads. The good news is that every city, even such paragons of sprawl as Phoenix, Dallas, and our own Calgary, has a walking city at its center. And every city has dense, walkable neighborhoods that can be nourished and expanded through intelligent urbanism. The walking city is the true city of the future. Even megacities of 20 million can be livable places when they balance density with parks and plazas and other public spaces. The transportation system that will work in the megacities of the future clearly won't be based on cars. There just isn't enough room, but on transit. But you can't just slap a multi-billion-dollar rail project onto a city and expect it to morph into Paris or Milan. Even a well-conceived and extensive metro system won't work if planners and developers haven't given serious thought to commercial and residential density around stations. Transit always has to be matched with artistry and imagination to a city's morphology and density. I recently returned from Shanghai, which in only 20 years has built the world's largest subway system from scratch. It is an ultra-modern marvel with 16 lines carrying 8 million passengers a day. The average ride is about 60 cents. At rush hour, a new train arrives every 2 minutes. 7 years from now, there will be 22 lines. There's already a line that goes from the airport to the downtown that goes 420 kilometers an hour, magnetic levitation train. The vast majority of Shanghainese live their lives without cars for very practical reasons. Not only costs a lot to buy a car, it costs tens of thousands of dollars to buy a license plate. But most people don't need cars. The subway goes everywhere, and you can travel between cities cheaply thanks to a nationwide network of high-speed trains. When you get transportation right, you go a long way to getting a city right, but it's no guarantee. Shanghai is an example of the truth that excellent transit does not always make for excellent urbanism. This is something you realize when you leave, or try to leave, the megacity of Shanghai. Any trip by road or rail involves half an hour of scrolling past seemingly endless 20 or 30-story condo towers. The recent movie Her, which was partly filmed in Shanghai, hints at the reality. No wonder that the image of a future Los Angeles as a Chinese megacity where people are so cut off from each other that they fall in love with their cell phones' operating systems chilled so many people. Until the turn of the century, most Shanghainese lived in 2 to 3-story brick row houses, separated by car-free alleys, an urban form that was great at fostering community. In the last 20 years, the population has been massively decanted into sterile condo towers where families hide from their neighbors behind double-thick steel doors. We are building this kind of city, the mega city of mega towers, in too much of the world. Toronto, in particular, is engaged in a spate of residential tower building, a disaster made all the more disastrous by the slow-motion disaster at City Hall, a situation that has created a transit deficit that will take years, if not decades, to overcome. In too many North American cities, there's a vast oversupply of 2 kinds of housing: the residential condo tower and the single-family, often single-story house, whose exorbitant price puts it out of reach of most young suburbanites. The result is a schizophrenic city type, where the only choice of housing is between her dystopia and leave it to beaver semi-suburbia. We can do better than this. Allow a long-time flaneur, an urban stroller, who has spent the past 30 years wandering through some of the best and worst cities on the planet, an observation. The kinds of cities that people are most attracted to, whose citizens consistently rate themselves the happiest, tend to be cities whose buildings vary in height between 3 and 7 stories. The sweet spot is somewhere around 5 stories. It's a height that most people can negotiate on foot rather than by elevator, and which, in the temperate latitudes, allows sunlight to reach the surface of an interior courtyard. In most of the cities I've loved spending time in, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Brussels, Zurich, Brooklyn, Berlin, Florence, and my current hometown of Montreal, the buildings tend to fall into this range. 3 to 7 stories allows a high enough density to support transit, great retail, and abundant services, and enough variation in dwelling types to permit a real mixing of classes. It is a city that, throughout history, has proven conducive to fostering the conditions of civilization. Yet too often, when planners try to site multi-unit apartment buildings in North American cities, they are met by protests from anti-density NIMBYs, the Not in My Backyard Brigade, or worse yet, howls from the bananas, those who believe we should build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. Just as often, cities get the formula wrong, opting for heavy-hauling transit, but failing to zone for high-density residential in close proximity to the stations. Or they build density without provision for transit, creating resentment by clogging neighborhood streets with even more cars. The city of the future, simply put, is what cities at their best have always been. Dense, but not too dense. Physically diverse enough to encourage a mixture of incomes and living arrangements and ages. And most importantly, built for people. And by that I really mean built for people rather than cars, which in the 21st century implies making provision for mass transit and active forms of transportation like walking and bike riding. Many places are getting the mix right. Vancouver's Translink has become a model for other cities in North America for a number of reasons. Its authority over a broad region allows it to make the transit riding experience seamless and usually painless. Vancouver boldly wraps retail and residential density around Canada Line and SkyTrain stations, creating a model of transit-oriented development you'd be hard-pressed to find outside of Europe and Asia. And it puts express bus stops right next to light rail stations, rather than surrounding them with vast park and rides, which is the case in too many other North American cities. Montreal, the Plateau, the city's most populous borough, is another great example of future-forward urbanism. With its extensive car-free zones, it already feels like the most convincing outpost of Europe on the continent. And I'm proud to announce that just this week, its mayor, Luc Ferrandez, announced speed limits to be decreased to 30 kilometers an hour throughout the borough, and that he was planning to double its already extensive network of bike paths. The city I just returned from, Denver, a car-centered city, if ever there was one, is in the midst of transforming itself into a mecca for refugees from car culture. 10 years ago, Denver, a city which now has a huge population of millennials, voted in a sales tax increase to fund a multi-billion-dollar expansion of Fast Tracks, the region's light rail and commuter train network. Within a few years, it will build 200 kilometers of new lines, 57 stations, an airport train, and tens of thousands of units of transit, proximate, rental, and condo units. Which means by 2021, Denver will have transformed itself into something I thought I'd never see, a Western American city where you can get through your whole life in a rich and rewarding fashion without ever owning a car. It is coming to Denver. The city of the future, in other words, is coming together piecemeal, in dribs and drabs, in a few places, especially those blessed with enlightened administrations and engaged and environmentally aware citizens. The question remains, in the next 7 years, will we see a fully realized city of the future anywhere on this continent? Well, in as much as I consider myself a realist, I'm not holding my breath. In 1979, I read a book called Make Room, Make Room. It was published in the year I was born, 1966. The author, Harry Harrison, imagined life in the faraway year of 1999, when the population of New York City hits 40 million, and the United States is undergoing widespread ecological collapse. Some of you may recall that it was made into a movie with Charlton Heston, in which he intones the magnificent line, "Soylent Green is people." I remember that as a 13-year-old, I was confused by the ending. In the book, doomsayers predict the end of the world for the coming millennium, but as the ball drops in the Big Apple, the only thing catastrophic that happens is that a screen in Times Square announces that the population of the United States has reached 344 million. It was only later that I realized that Harrison was saying that Armageddon was coming not by sudden detonation, but by slow boil. And it turns out the author wasn't too far off. In 2014, the combined population of Canada and the US is 354 million. And as a bizarre footnote, college students everywhere seem to be chugging a meal replacement called Soylent. But that's another story. The global population is headed for 9 billion by mid-century. The Malthusian future is coming, just a little slower than Harrison anticipated. We might be able to manage this rate of growth if, in too many places, we weren't so resolutely dedicated to the same old bad ideas. Thanks to our refusal to give up fossil fuels, we'll likely have our hands full just trying to insulate our cities from a future Harrison didn't imagine, the future of global warming and climate chaos. Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, I believe, were just the first salvos in what will become a massive and ongoing assault from the oceans. Coastal cities in particular will suffer. Experts from the Netherlands are already being paid enormous fees by local governments on the eastern seaboard for advice on how to survive the coming rise in sea level. On the Central Plains, community-flattening tornadoes, and in California, fire-nados are already becoming a lot more frequent and a lot more violent. Places that are dry now, I'm looking at you, Phoenix, will get a lot drier. And places that are wet will get a lot wetter. Not only coastal communities, but also river-based cities, such as Winnipeg and Fort McMurray, where 100-year floods are already showing signs of becoming biannual events. If we continue to stick with our petroleum-based transportation system, which globally has now surpassed agriculture as the leading driver of climate change, we can expect urban life to get a lot dirtier. Last year, the people of Calgary had a near miss as rail cars full of tar sands oil almost spilled into the Bow River. And real tragedy occurred not far from where I live, as dirty oil detonated in the center of Lac Mégantic, killing 47. In North America, fracking is contaminating groundwater, and oil train derailments are becoming almost weekly events. That, by the way, is not an argument for building pipelines. It's an argument for using a lot less oil. 1 block from my home in Montreal, rail cars laden with bitumen from the Albertan oil patch rumble their way to the refineries in the east end of Montreal. It's an accident waiting to happen, one that could turn my neighborhood into an inferno. In the cities of the developing world, the absurd circular logic of the automobile, in which a burgeoning middle class tries to insulate itself from congestion and pollution by purchasing more and more automobile cocoons, will prove to be a frantic race to the bottom. Their present, unfortunately, might be our near future. The face masks that screen out deadly PM 2.5 particles, which I recently saw all over in Shanghai, could soon be coming to a 7-Eleven near you. Though I'm a realist, I'm also a hopeful type. I have to be. I have a 2-year-old son, and there's no way I'm giving up on his future. My wife and I already live like it's the future, which is to say, a little like people did a century ago, when our neighborhood was young. It was an area platted out during the age of the streetcar, and its density makes it extremely walkable, with housing types catering to all ages and incomes. There are expensive 2-story townhouses, spacious triplexes, and affordable rental apartments atop corner stores. We walk, bike, and ride transit everywhere, take trains whenever we can, and live in a 3rd-floor walk-up. Neither of us has ever owned a car. So, hopeful, deluded fool that I am, I'll continue to campaign for a future in which our cities achieve the mix of density and amenity that will achieve a sustainable future. There is enough desire on the part of the millennial generation, now 88 million strong on this continent. There are more of them than there are baby boomers, for decent urban living and active transportation to give me hope. There are enough examples of good urbanism, whether it's transit-oriented development in Portland and Denver, parking space-free condos in Toronto, new light rail line in Waterloo, to keep me writing about places where inspired planners, municipal officials, and urbanists are getting things right. In Invisible Cities, which consists of a series of imagined dialogues between Marco Polo and the Mongol Emperor of China, the Kublai Khan, the Kublai Khan notes that the European explorer has described many cities, but never his hometown. And Marco Polo replies, "Every time I describe a city, I am saying something about Venice. In the same way, when I talk about cities, I am also talking about the place I live in, Montreal. I'm talking about what I hope it will be in the future and what I know it can be in the future." In 2021, my son will be close to being a preteen. I'll be a slightly grumpier, slightly more middle-aged father. I fully intend to take Desmond exploring in the cities of the future, by subway, by bicycle, by foot. But the places we'll enjoy the most, I suspect, won't look that futuristic at all. The best of them will be what cities have always been, since humans started gathering in them 9,000 years ago. Places dense with humanity and connection and civility and hope. Places that people don't want to flee from, but to linger in. Places, in short, that feel like home. And one last comment from a great man. What is the city but the people? Thank you.
We'll move to a little. I'll ask. I have lots of questions, but I don't want to. Just because I have a microphone doesn't mean I get to ask all of them. So we'll turn it over to you very quickly. If I could ask Michael if you could grab the other running mic. So just if when you have a question, raise your hand, and Michael Stevens will bring you a microphone, and we'll get that going. But Taras, it's phenomenal, really amazing sense of what a city is. One of the audience questions last night by Arno Kopecky, the writer, was, and this is I was thinking this during your talk, is I have a few questions, but one of them is, as a city gets more desirable, does it not also get more expensive? And if it does, what does that mean for the people who live there?
Yeah, it's an issue that cities across North America in particular are grappling with. It's the 50th anniversary of the coining of the term gentrification. It was coined by a British sociologist half a century ago, and we've been dealing with it for a long time. The interesting thing is that for so many years there was a flight from cities. The cities were not the places to be. And now there's a return to it, and managing this return, and we're in a contested place right now. You mentioned the Coast Salish, you mentioned all the First Nations people whose land this is. We're close to in the Woodwards building, where there has been fights over gentrification. Stan Douglas's great photo mural of the Gastown riots is nearby. A lot of communities are dealing with it in really interesting ways. A lot of American cities are really insisting on affordable housing and building in transit proximate affordable housing, building in formulas that allow them to do it. I was really impressed by Denver, and I guess it's because I'm just back from there, but they really made a convincing case. The Urban Land Conservancy there buys up land near projected transit stations, light rail stations and commuter rail stations, and sets them aside. They've even bought up old motels, which they're going to convert and turn into transitional homes for homeless people. Portland is doing similar things. I've heard Vancouver is making tentative steps in this direction, and the Woodward's building is always sort of trotted out as an example of that. I think there could be a lot more in Canadian cities. I don't think we're ambitious enough, but it's an ongoing issue. These cities are, places of contest, of, classes clashing. The best kind of cities, the cities that I've always loved, the cities that have achieved that mix, do it by offering a variety of housing in the same neighborhood, often in the same building. My sort of introduction to great cities was living in Paris in the 1990s, and I realized that within one block there was a whole variety of incomes gathered together. For too much of the time in North American cities, we've segregated everything and put our problem neighborhoods in the downtown east side or a Skid Row, that kind of thing. That has to stop. We're all citizens together. We're all in this together. Yeah,
and that brings me to the handheld you're using, we'll use for the audience, and if we can switch to your lav. There's a handheld up there. Never mind. I just saw them looking for it. One of the so Shanghai has been able to build the world's biggest subway system, but this brings me to they have a government very much in control of a city. In Vancouver, the conversation we just had on galleries, there's the conversation of what is the role of government versus what is the role of sort of the market, or in this city it would be the developer market. In that conversation around providing public living or housing, where do you see where progressive cities moving? Is it if you build 10 stories, 2 of them or 5 stories is the ideal. 2 of them have to be low rent or controlled. Is it the government building the building? Is it the government setting rules on buildings? What role does government or the sort of public-private push play?
Interesting question. There are formulas, 10 or 15% in some places. A lot of cities, the municipal government mandates that kind of thing. To tell you the truth, I'm no expert on that kind of thing, and not much of an observer of it either. I just know that it's the kind of thing that should be happening. China is an interesting example. They can build just about whatever they want. Massive expropriations, examples of eminent domain. The Shanghai Subway is trotted out as this sort of marvel. They've literally built the largest subway system in the world in 20 years, more track mileage than New York, but there's been a lot of suffering along the way. We live in a democracy where everything is a lot more difficult, and that's how it should be, I think.
Right, and to continue that, there's a lot of talk always with anything public. There are people who are interested in privatizing it. What, in terms of transit systems, have you seen is, again, the role, who should be paying for transit expansion?
Oh gosh, there's so many different funding techniques with transit. A sales tax, property taxes. Los Angeles voted in, the population of Los Angeles, one of the most car-centric cities on the continent, voted in a sales tax increase over 30 years that is financing a massive increase in the rail transit in that city. Denver did the same thing. There's not very much so-called fare box recovery with transit systems. They're almost never profitable. And there's a sort of illusion out there among libertarians that if they're not profitable, they don't deserve to exist. Transit scholars, and I'm very much a transit observer, a transit connoisseur, but definitely not an expert in the subject of financing that kind of thing. They consistently say the more sources of funding, the better. And they can come from a variety of taxes. They can come from congestion charges, which is what London has done, and which is a great technique, where you use the stick of charging people more money to come downtown and pour it into a transit system. The transit system, in turn, becomes a lot faster, more efficient, more pleasurable to ride. In London, they've done it with buses. There are so many techniques out there. The techniques vary from city to city. As a strap hanger, I'm on the side of transit. And I'm even a little agnostic about things like public-private partnerships. When I went in, I was like, transit systems should be municipalized. That allows for, sort of a greater authority, greater seamlessness, that kind of thing. But there have been some very good examples of, well-run transit lines, still under a municipal authority, but running individual lines, not necessarily for profit. They make money out of it, but they're still in alliance with the transit authority of the region.
Do you mean that like Burnaby would have a system and Surrey would have a system, and they'd both be controlled by a
it's
region?
usually done by lines. For example, in Denver, there's one line is run by, or the new commuter lines are run by a different agency, but they're all under the aegis of the RTD. It's like it's like the Canada Line and Translink, basically.
Right. And where, in terms of community, who drive? I mean, we're in a neighborhood that is an active community. And what is our role? When you give the example of her, many people say this, that in really big cities, I know friends of mine who live in New York say they feel like they live alone together. This is this term that I've heard a lot in cities, of people who may see 100 people, 1,000, 1 million people in a day, but they don't know very many. What is the role of, and someone asked this again last night, you said the playfulness, what is the role of engaging people both on a personal day-to-day, so we don't become, we don't marry Surrey, the operating system. So what is the role of engaging in a day-to-day level, and then bigger when it means about political activity as well?
I'm making the argument for physical spaces being really determinant in cities of community. And the places that I've really enjoyed going, and I've really seen examples of these cities, of this kind of emerging community, have been places that have encouraged some kind of plaza life, street life, courtyard life. The example I think of the most are like housing developments, 19th century housing developments in Amsterdam, or even Barcelona, where you have 5 or 6 story buildings surrounding an interior courtyard, and the people know each other in these kind of places. I showed a picture of Copenhagen, the Potato Rows, a beautiful little neighborhood where they've cut down on traffic and people meet for picnics in the middle of the street. This is a density that's mid-rise density, 3, 5, maybe 7 stories, but there's some provision for sort of block scale community. And the dystopia that's emerging in places like Shanghai, and I'd argue Toronto, and I'd argue we see that in some parts of Vancouver too, like Falls Creek, is just sort of, the brave new world of, the upper elites, the alphas, living in condo towers, but not really participating with the community. And it's a way of dividing people, it's a way of separating, creating class barriers. The cities that have really sort of become the most attractive and the legendary and the most livable, the ones we think of, are the ones that have this residential morphology and density that we don't build enough of in North America. And as much as I was impressed by Shanghai, as a strap hanger riding that system, it's something else. You can go everywhere around the city. There is this underlying feeling of alienation, of people's lives being, the rudders of their lives being taken away from them. You really sense that. So there's a middle ground, and I just don't think we're building enough of that.
And we'll get to just very quickly, what is the role of winter? I mean, when you talk about Barcelona, and people often talk, they're like, oh, the piazzas of Europe, and then you say like, well, who wants to sit outside in January? And here, Vancouver, of course, there's a slightly longer season, but Montreal and Toronto aren't going to build, piazzas are miserable.
Yeah, actually, I talked to Jan Gell in Copenhagen. He's this sort of legendary city designer who pedestrianized the center of Copenhagen. I went there in November, and it was kind of miserable out. But there were people sitting under blankets, which the cafes provided, these big fur blankets. And I said, this is amazing, I mean, it goes down to -1 or 2. There's snow a lot of the times. And it felt very Mediterranean. And he said, yeah, we created a street life. And what the thing is, you can't plan for those 50 days or the 60 days that are really cold. Plan your city for the fine days. And admittedly, there'll be some days you can't sit around. He said another great thing about pedestrian zones and benches. Pedestrian zones often get a bad rap because, they attract homeless people, and the pedestrian mall turns into a zone for drug dealers. And he said, well, the thing you have to do then is build twice as many benches for people to sit on. Sure, the drunks will sit on some, but just make it more inclusive for everyone. And it really did work. There are small knots of people drinking Kronenberg, what is it? Danish beer, Carlsberg. But there's also just people enjoying the city. So it's a question of attitude. And I really liked what he said. I said, listen, Jan, I live in Canada. This is a cold place. We can't really build these plazas. He said, but think of how many really, truly cold days you have and plan for the 200 days where people can be outside. That's the attitude to take.
So I did promise that I wouldn't talk too long, and I already have. So who has a question in the front? Yes.
Yeah, you talked about what can kill cities in terms of intensification of increased densities and how people stay in a glass walls. But another aspect that can kill cities is suburbia, where people who choose to live outside the boundaries of the city that they work, and they choose to use cars instead of transit because the transit that exists is not efficient or it's not extensive as it should be. And we use models like, okay, well, in UK they have a wonderful rail system, but that country is pretty small. Or you got China, where it's like, okay, they have a really good rail system, but there's a huge population to where there's a need for that rail. How can we apply those models to Canada, where cities are really far apart from each other, and where people who use public transit by rail, there's not enough demand, there's not enough people to use those means of transportation as it is. So how can we improve that with a low density of population?
That was exactly the question that I was asking in places like Denver and Phoenix. And what they're doing there is they're changing the DNA of the cities. They're planning for 10, 20, 30 years. And what they're doing is they're building rail transit, and at the same time as they build stations, they're building density around the stations. And Vancouver has been doing this for a while. The North American city is changing. A lot of places that people have preconceived notions of being car-centric, like Los Angeles, for example, are doing amazing things with transit-oriented development and with a lot of affordable housing built in, so it's for really all classes. Downtowns, which have been, car zones for a long time, are actually seeing families move in because schools and supermarkets are being added. It's a slow change, I agree with you. There is a difference in density. There are solutions to that too, though. There are systems that aren't as intensive as light rail, as subways. Bus rapid transit, for example, is one that's been used very successfully in Asia, in Istanbul, and many South American cities and Chinese cities. It costs about 1/10 of the price of building a subway. And you can serve suburbs, you can serve lower density places quite well with feeder buses. Bogota is a good model that can be applied to many North American cities. It really is a slow change, but it's a change that I'm confident that's happening because people in their 20s and 30s are really less interested in car ownership. There's a huge, to use a cliche, sea change coming. And that change involves, more openness to public transit, less interest in being tied down to a car, and more flexibility in using things like bike share to solve the last mile problem, to go multimodal, car to go, zip car. All of these things allow for that's a cocktail of transportation choices. That means that you don't make that decision to buy a car and all that goes with that, which is often a relocation to suburbia.
Just to follow up on that, most of the people I know who didn't own cars, I mean, I don't have a car, but I don't have kids. And what is going to happen when these 80 million, probably soon to be 100 million millennials have kids and need that second, third bedroom? Not that everyone has to have kids or a family, but many of them will. And many of the people who buy cars are because they have to move kids around?
Well, knock wood. I've got a 2-year-old, and so far we've gotten by without owning a car. We do it with that cocktail of transportation choices. Going out to the in-laws with our equivalent of car to go, or riding commuter rail out there. But I've got a friend. I've got a really hardcore cyclist friend in Copenhagen. A guy called Michael Colville Anderson, half Canadian, half Danish, but he's like the biggest bicycle campaigner. And I said, what happens in Denmark, the cycling capital? And he says, well, yeah, people don't own cars until their late 20s or 30s when they have a family. And then they have them for a few years, but they don't use them to drive to work. They use them for trips to the country. They use them for, trips to IKEA, trips to the in-laws. It's like the pattern of car ownership in Japan, where people ride the trains, but they do have a car for a certain period in their life. I just think that with the new car share availabilities out there, that even that won't be necessary. You won't have to have a car for the 5 or 10 years that you're raising kids. The morphology, the sprawl of North American cities makes it seem like a hopeless battle sometimes. And sometimes I feel like, in a Montreal winter when I'm taking Desmond to daycare in minus 20 weather and waiting for the bus, I wonder if I've made the right decision. But that kid's pretty tough. He was born in Montreal. He doesn't seem to mind the cold. I'm the whiner.
He'll rebel and buy an Escalade.
I think he might.
This is what we didn't have.
He's going to be in the new Jacques Villeneuve, I think.
Any other questions from the audience? I have a few more, but yes, one at the back over there. Wait till the mic gets to you. We'll wait. Our Pegasus delivers the microphone.
My question's more regarding towards active transportation. Mm-hmm. So I actually lived in Copenhagen for 8 months, and Copenhagen, Amsterdam, biking is so part of their culture that it's almost like a second nature to bike everywhere. Whereas in North America, for transportation to seem to be successful, it has to try and be as efficient and as easy as possible. So with those transportations becoming faster and easier, wouldn't that kind of take away from the active side of transportation, and everyone will just start focusing more on just the actual transportation itself?
Maybe there's something I'm missing there. Do you mean that the public transportation, like
rails or SkyTrains or buses and stuff like that? As those increase and they become more prominent, and there's more buses, more SkyTrains, more everything of that, don't you think that might somewhat take away from the active side of transportation, from people walking and biking and so
When did you live in Copenhagen? Was it recently?
Yeah, about a year ago.
Okay. Did you notice the incredible mix of transportation choices? They're building something called the City Ring, which is a sort of an orbital metro system. They've got commuter rail. You can go out to Malmo in Sweden in half an hour. And, people use cargo bikes too. One doesn't preclude the other, in my experience anyway.
Yeah,
they've got the balance.
Focusing more
right.
on when it seemed that in Amsterdam and Copenhagen, biking is part of their culture. They're so used to biking, where I'm talking more towards North American cities, where people are used to cars and they're used to taking public transit. I'm just asking, do you ever feel like it could take away from the active side of transportation?
I don't. You know what? I think that anything that sort of gets people away from cars is on the side of the angels. You're going in the right direction, and then bicycles become more. I'll talk about one thing that is fantastic for getting. And this is how Copenhagen started, and a lot of French cities started. They started with bike share, which totally banalized cycling. It took it away from the realm of spandex and sports and, the kind of macho kind of courier thing. And everybody was doing it all of a sudden. You've got a big problem here in Vancouver. And when I talked about Vancouver to my friends in Europe, they're astonished that this great cycling city, great potential for cycling, it's relatively temperate for a Canadian city, still doesn't have a bike share system. And bike share systems are not just for tourists. I use mine, Bixby, all the time. There's one at the end of my street. I'll take Desmond to daycare, drop him off, and then ride back home on the bike share. It's the last mile problem. It's really great. And it gets, since bike share started in Montreal, people I've never seen riding bicycles are riding them. It's just become part of their transportation cocktail. But you here in Vancouver are obsessed with helmets. It's a real problem. You have great bike paths, and a lot of them are protected too. Get over it. And this idea when I bring up like bike helmet washing stations, which was like mooted. What you do is you tame the beast on the road, and the beast on the road is the automobile. You put your effort there. You make safe bicycle infrastructure, and you don't build a culture of fear. I'm citing my friend Michael Colville-Anderson a lot here, but you don't make bicycling a scary activity. You make it just as easy as, putting on your shoes or vacuuming a carpet, that kind of thing. It's a daily activity. It's not a big deal. So I think that's the best thing that we can do in North American cities. Montreal, oddly enough, in spite of its winter, has the highest bicycle mode share of any North American city now. Even places like Portland, which is supposed to be so great. And we don't have helmet laws. And there aren't that many accidents. It's not that bad. So in the last couple of weeks, there have been some problems with trucks, but we're taming the trucks right now.
I've heard that the safest thing for bicyclists is the more bicycles you have on the road, the safer it gets.
Safety in numbers, yeah.
Totally. And what does it mean for a culture? The die-hard bicyclists always get kind of angry on a nice day. They're like, oh, the amateurs are out. What does it mean for a city? Are there any cities that have, we have graduated licensing in most parts of Canada, I believe. I think there may be a few that you just go straight to driving, which is terrifying. But it's terrifying that bikes don't, to me, there's no, the number of times you see someone blow through a stop sign or a red light, and it's like, bicycle rights, and you're like, no, bicycle rights, bicycle responsibilities too. Are there any cities that regulate bicycle use?
Actually, Holland does a great thing where they have mandatory bicycle education for elementary school students, and it's quite extensive. They don't get licenses, that kind of thing, but there's actual courses because you have to learn how to behave well on a bicycle path. You might not know it when you're there, especially in Copenhagen, where they're like having cell phone conversations as they cycle alongside each other. But they've built conversation lanes. They've built wider bicycle lanes where people can ride alongside each other. But they're kind of pros at cycling. Really, the key is separated bicycle infrastructure in places like that, where the bike paths are physically raised off the roads a little bit. Some of them are marked on the side with lights. They're very much separated from the traffic, and there are severe fines, like jail time, for anybody who hits a cyclist. In New York, you can kill someone on a bicycle right now in a lot of American cities and suffer no consequences. In Montreal, a truck driver ran over an 80-year-old pedestrian a couple of weeks ago, and he was back on the road driving his truck the next day. They take these things a lot more seriously in Europe. They have tamed the beast. They have tamed there are calls in a lot of European cities, in London in particular, to decrease the speed to 20 miles an hour for all vehicles in the city. And it looks like it's going to happen.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can you help us understand Denver a bit more? Denver not only has a great transit system, it has a fantastic art gallery, as you know. Mm-hmm. It has a superb historical museum. It's got huge heritage districts. It's got a really lively Latino cultural area. Yeah. And I kept asking people, how did this happen? What is driving this? Who's behind it? And the most I got was they kept naming a couple of philanthropists.
Yeah, true.
And so that's kind of the American way of identifying some hero, heroine in this case, who got out there and did this stuff. But I said, it's got to be much more than that. What has driven you to do this? Because as you were saying, it is counterintuitive to go to a great Western city like Denver and find that it is this thriving community. And it is really a model of everything you've been talking about. How do we get there? What are they doing? What's in the water? Who's Who's drinking the Kool-Aid? Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. That was kind of shocking to go to an American city where I was staying in a hotel and I'd walk down the hall. There's a little bit of narco-tourism going on. And there are a lot of middle-aged guys with really big smiles on their face. It's a liberal place. It's a place that's attracted millennials. I don't really know. I was there for 4 days. I didn't seek the deep roots for it. You know, I think there are a lot of refugees from California who got sick with the California dream gone wrong. You know, Hunter S. Thompson would end up in Aspen, that kind of thing. I was really surprised by the place. I don't know how they do it. I kept on asking people why there wasn't more of an oppositional culture. If you go to L.A., for example, you have the Bus Riders Union, which is most represents Latinos and African Americans, and they say, you know, this fancy light rail is for rich people, and it doesn't serve our neighborhoods. And I talked to groups representing African Americans, and they were fine with the light rail in Denver. It's a place with not a lot of road rage. People in Denver are confused about it themselves. I read several editorials saying, "Why don't we have road rage? You know, is it because we're a mile up? Is the air thinner here?" I really don't know. But as you know, in every place, it's sort of cultural. There's history. They're the kind of people who have been attracted there. It was really funny for me to compare it to Calgary because physically, it's quite similar. It's, you know, on the plains, approaching the mountains. You know, there's sort of a Western culture there. You go to the airport, there's people with cowboy hats on. But they're doing so many things so much better than Calgary in so many ways. I mean, just the density and the affordable housing they're building around transit stations, and there's no controversy about it. It's really interesting. I wish I knew the deep roots. I'll have to go back.
Yeah, you have to go and write a book about it, but don't smoke too much dope or you'll forget why you went.
This is not my style anyway.
It's interesting, when we did SPUR in Calgary, one of the conversations was around, that was happening in the city was this bike lane, a protected bike lane route. And if Calgary can build the Calgary that the rest of Canada imagines is there is not really the Calgary that actually is there. I mean, that they're because people demanded it, and they have a leadership that, you know, there's a push and pull between people demanding and people being inspired, and they approved a $9 million bike lane project.
But there's a huge backlash going on, as you probably know.
Yeah, but they passed it, and that's something.
Yeah,
so,
true.
What is the push and pull between, you know, build it and they will come, like this, you know, we'll build a subway out to a series of towers and they'll move there, or build it where they are? What in terms of, do you try to drive a subway into a dense area, or do you build light rail out and be like, I hope people, you know, we're going to encourage people to move here?
The most successful is where there's a real consultation of planning with a regional or a municipal government that gets it. The zoning's in. You can't. I mean, I've been to a lot of places that have built subway lines out to meadows. You know, Delhi is building a subway system to places where there's absolutely nothing around right now. And some of this, I mean, there's always something in Delhi, but there's very little density. It isn't build it and they will come. You really have to plan it. And Vancouver, I think, is doing that very well. I mean, you go out along the SkyTrain line out to New Westminster, for example. There's a lot of thought into bringing buses into there and to residential residency, density and commercial density, that kind of thing.
Do you have another question at the back there?
Yeah, thank you, Taras. It's been a long time, and thank you for your writing. Just a quick question about Denver, why it is so different from Calgary and Vancouver. Early money, silver mining, whatever, 1870s, 1880s, that chose to stay. Those are two things that Vancouver doesn't have. We didn't have early money. We borrowed it. CPR came with borrowed money, etc. The fortunes that have been kind of hoovered out of BC tend to go elsewhere. And only in the last 20, 30 years are we making fortunes here, but they often wander away. They go to retire to Hawaii, Friedlander goes to Singapore, and so on. So I hate to say it, but it's a kind of follow the money question. If you wonder why the Denver Art Museum is so flash and has so many great paintings, etc., it's a follow the money question back to having people make fortunes, but then choose to keep them in the city and reinvest them. And I think that we're at that precipice now in Vancouver to convince people to actually spend their fortunes on culture and improvement, et cetera. But that's the big difference.
That's a great point. What did Wallace Stegner say? There are two kinds of people, boomers and stickers. And in Denver, there were a lot of stickers. Wandering around the old downtown core, you could see the evidence of this going back to the early 20th century. The City Beautiful movement was really strong there. And gorgeous architecture, these amazing buildings, and real evidence of sort of an investment in the community. You might know Stan Brakhage. He was from Denver, left Denver, but came back and taught there and left his papers to the university. I mean, people like being from Denver, and in places that are more built around extractive economies, I'm looking at a lot of Alberta, for example, they're more of the boomers. They move on. They don't necessarily stick around a place. That's not all of Alberta, but that's the sort of oil mentality.
No, it's a really good point, because Wallace Stegner, who you referred to originally, was a Saskatchewan boy.
Yeah.
And wrote some beautiful lyrical books about his youth in Saskatchewan, but ended up at Stanford and stayed there, et cetera, the typical kind of migration of ideas and skills. So anyway, thank you.
How do you avoid bad policy? In the neighborhood I live in Toronto, there became this very popular idea of this is a neighborhood. It's for kids to walk the streets and go to the park, and it should be safe against, these... and there's a kind of thing that happens in a lot of these neighborhoods. We don't want these 905 cars ripping through, and we're going to put in speed bumps. Mm-hmm. And speed bumps were great politically, because you could call your city councilor and say, there's an SUV and it just drives too fast down the street, and they'd put in a speed bump, and you'd be like, my councilor cares about me. Speed bumps were terrible. They don't reduce speed, and the worst thing they do is they're terrible for ambulances. And what they do is they have people accelerating rapidly between them. So they were kind of good politics, bad policy. How do we not get caught up in this kind of... I'm sure bike lanes are great. I feel like I believe in them, but how are we not going to look back and be like, that turned out to have... Who are the leaders in, they're obviously planners, but what is the role of the public in thinking, not just rushing into something like speed bumps?
Well, I just feel that we do these sort of piecemeal, little fix-it solutions. And people have been thinking about this for a long time. That's why I wrote Straphanger. I wanted to see what people were doing right around the world. And there are things like, living streets, Bornerfs in Holland, where there's no speed bumps or anything like that. As a matter of fact, they've eliminated curbs from the streets. They've made streets more complex. So when a car enters, they're kind of going around potted planters and things like that. It's seriously, but it really works. The more complex you make a streetscape. There's a great place called Vauban in Freiburg. It's I went to it thinking it was a car-free suburb, but they actually do allow cars in. And it is a suburb. It's a suburb, but sort of with 2 or 3 story buildings in it. And if you opt not to have a space in the parking lot on the edge of town, you save about 17,000 euros. But a lot of people keep their cars. And you can drive into Vauban, but you have to drive very slowly because there are kids around. You're really almost driving on a sidewalk. There are all these design alternatives that already exist around the world. And if our best idea is putting up speed bumps or creating traffic mazes, we're just being lazy and we're not looking elsewhere. People have been grappling with this idea for a long time. There are smaller cities in Holland. I think Gothenburg is one of them. That closed its whole city to center city to traffic, but made it very efficient for bicycles to get through. There are solutions out there. Citizen involvement is important, but if it's just like imploring power to stick in some traffic slowing devices on the street, that's not enough. It needs to be a bigger vision.
Well, one more. Absolutely.
In regards to your statement about taming the beast, I would actually like to know what your view is on BC's carbon or gas taxes. Do you think that that kind of measure actually does encourage transit and bicycle use? Maybe from examples you've seen around the world as well, you could draw on.
I don't know. I think that a carbon tax is essential. I tax myself on carbon when I'm an advocate for all kinds of sustainable transportation, but we still don't have, damn it, an electric cross-Canada railway system. So I came here by plane, and I tax my own carbon. Carbon tax makes a whole lot of sense. It's a market-based solution. It can fly, it can be sold in a lot of places. We're not doing that right now. We're actually subsidizing fossil fuel producers in too many places. So, I mean, I think that by making car and airplane transportation more costly, of course, that's sort of a stick that will drive people to transit and bicycles and active modes of transportation. But really the best thing you can do, and the thing that I saw in places like Bogota, is make transportation incredibly effective, comfortable, and fast. And the best symbol I saw of this was in Bogota. And you can see it in places like Curitiba in Brazil too, where the people on the buses, and these are buses that you board like subways on the street, there's prepayment, they're very fast, are whipping past the people in the Mercedes and the Hummers and all of the armored cars because they're stuck in congestion. That's a really powerful statement. And it doesn't take long if you're stuck in a 3-hour traffic jam and you see the buses going by to say, I'm opting for that. You've got to make cars in the city the least attractive, the least effective ways of doing things. Denver has a problem, Calgary has a problem, Vancouver to a certain extent has a problem. It's gotten a lot better. It's turned its downtown streets into these network of one-way raceways. And as much as I admire Denver, it's still like that. They're hoping people are going to move downtown. There are 25,000 people living in downtown Denver right now, which is a huge change. But the experience of walking around downtown Denver and Calgary and so many other North American cities is, waiting far too long for a light to change. Meanwhile, cars are whipping through the city, or whipping through the streets. Who's going to want to raise a family there? Yeah. You might live there as a young executive, that kind of thing. So Melbourne in Australia has done really intelligent things by, slowing down cars, making streets 2 ways, reducing speed limits, creating alley bars and residences. We could be doing a lot more of that.
There's a great quote from, I believe, the former mayor of Bogota, who said, a great society is not where everybody can afford a car, it's where no one has to have a car. And it was a great flip. It wasn't, it was the Latin American dream.
That's Enrique Peñalosa. A citizen with a $30 bike should be treated the same as a citizen with a $30,000 car.
Yeah.
He's a quote machine, that guy.
And that idea that, why do we keep closing down the highways for these kind of marathons or whatever it was, this Rob Ford kind of ran on this. We're going to stop closing down the roads. And people are like, well, we close down the roads for cars pretty often, every other day. I think, the question, this is fascinating. Okay, people can't get enough of you.
Wonderful presentation, thank you.
Oh, thank
Especially the images were wonderful.
The words, not so much.
The words were good, too. One of the things I feel like you kind of set up in your presentation is the notion that, you talked about density, and you brought up beautiful images of Montreal. I love Montreal, love Barcelona, love Chicago, love the 3 to 5 story. I do feel the community works really well at that level in a kind of natural way. It kind of felt like you set up the high-density tower as it being a kind of impossibility to create community at that level. But you also open with statistics about how big the population is going to grow to and the size of our cities. Right. And we know that cities have always been the place people come to get ahead in the world. It can be an equalizer. It's an opportunity place. So I guess one of the things I struggle with is I think we can't give up on the high-density form. If tomorrow we could do away with that in Vancouver and we could do 5 stories across the entire city, then maybe we could meet the demand that's coming and that we need to take in a way as a kind of social justice measure if cities are a place for everybody. So I'm wondering, you've been looking at lots of cities. I can think of ideas myself, but are people doing things in the towers in ways of people living together, less about the form and more about how community is happening inside? Have you seen anything interesting happening at that level? Because I don't think we're going to do away with the tower here. So it's going to be about finding innovation, I think, to live in towers together, connected. And I'm just wondering what you've seen in your research.
I hear nothing but complaints from anybody who lives in towers. Some of them have turned into slums in a lot of places. I've talked to people who live in poorly maintained condo towers in Toronto. The idea kind of, was championed by Le Corbusier, who thought that this was the future. I think he was anti-human, anti-community. I get your point. I just think that we're building too many of them right now, particularly in Toronto, with not enough street life, with not enough transit right now. Transit's totally stalled in Toronto. So they're going 90 miles an hour down a one-way street with the condo towers they're building. You can achieve an incredible density with 3 to, say, 8-story buildings. Think of the Lower East Side in New York, which at one point was one of the densest places in the world, and those were buildings of that height. That's obviously not hugely desirable, but Paris, too, is a city that's not incredibly high, and they have huge densities. You can create a mega city, a livable mega city. It'll be bigger than Paris, but as long as you get the plazas, the public space right, and the mix of transportation right, I think it's doable. I'm not, fanatically against the 20-story building, but I've never really seen and some people like them, I guess. I just think that we're building too many of them, and we have this dichotomy in the city of, single-family homes and too many of these. I think Brent Todderan, who was here, was a big fan when we talked a few years ago of buildings of that height, of, the 5 to 8 story. It's just design, huh? Okay.
We live in a high-rise building.
Okay. How's it doing on community? How's it doing on connection with neighbors? And okay.
I think one of the problems in European discussions is European cities. I do a lot of work with European cities and international cities on the height question now.
Right.
And what I point out to European cities is they fundamentally understand how to do buildings at low-rise and mid-rise scale. And then they seem to forget all of that as soon as they let a high-rise in.
Right.
And then Rem Koolhaas thinking takes over, and these are terrible objects in space.
Right.
All they need to do is apply the same kind of urbanistic principles to every scale of building, including high-rises, and they can do high-rises well. Jan Gehl says that Jan Gehl doesn't like high-rises, as you and I both well know. But what he does say is he's not convinced that cities need to do high-rises, but if they choose to do high-rises, they should do them like Vancouver does, which is high praise from him as someone who doesn't appreciate high-rises, because he appreciates how we meld high-rise form into mid-rise form and create an active street wall.
Yeah, there have been some good examples of that where you have, but isn't the human part of those buildings the townhouse size aspects as opposed to the towers?
That's the beauty of it. You create the advantages of mid-rise, and in our early days we did podium and townhouses, which was I think a too low a scale, but now we're doing podium and mid-rise. The walkability, the urban room, the street activation gets created largely by the mid-rise, and then you get the benefit of the high-rise, which is higher density, as long as you separate the towers, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason I like when cities study what we do in Vancouver with regard to high-rise, but then they replicate them in terrible ways and forget all of our principles, like Toronto is doing right now. And I'm worried we as Vancouver are forgetting the principles that allowed us to do high-rises better, and we're starting to do them in poorer ways, I fear.
If you have a little time, and the next time I'm in town, take me to some of these successful mixes. I know that Charles Montgomery writes about them in
I'll
Happy
take you
City.
on the exact tour I took Jan Gehl on.
All right. If it can convince Jan Gehl, maybe there's hope.
Let's try. I want to raise your hand if you live in a building less than 3 stories tall. And then if we get up to 5 stories, 8 stories, 10 stories, and higher.
Which floor are you on?
15. There's a real mix there.
I apologize for this, but since you bring up the floor, we live on the 4th floor overlooking a courtyard because we're ground people. But here's what I tell people. My best friend lives in the same building. He also, until recently, worked at City Hall, and he's what I call a sky person. You can't convince him that life is better on the 3rd floor. He lives downtown because he loves the views to the mountains, et cetera, et cetera. He's got a fantastic lifestyle in his perspective, and he would consider you dogmatic telling him that he doesn't have a good lifestyle. So I call him a sky person, and I say the beauty of our forum is that it accommodates both ground people and sky people and doesn't tell them what a good lifestyle is. It lets them choose, which is what our forum allows in its best moments.
Interesting answer. In Montreal, we don't have lifestyles, we have lives.
and a team in the playoffs. We'll take one more question there.
That's me. A word on behalf of Calgary and a question. One of my favorite things about Calgary is the plus 15 system. And I know that this relates only to downtown high business towers, but it is a way of connecting tall buildings. And so that there is a street life essentially at the 2nd floor. Have you walked through it, Taras? Do you know the plus 15 system?
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah.
And what do you think of it?
I really dislike it. I think it's like the death of the street. I think it's like it feels like a privatized space to me. It feels like a super mall. It feels like the underground city in Montreal, where real interactions, the real danger and interest of the city is subtracted because of this sort of commercial oversight. I always feel like I'm being filmed there. I feel like, the performers are mandated. Minneapolis has the same kind of thing. It's called the Skyway system. I understand the rationale for it. In a cold climate, it makes a lot of sense. You can wander around the city. But I think they just gave up on the street. I think they gave up, and the street is the foundation of the city and of civilization. I just see it as a glorified mall. I mean, it provides a sense of safety and security to a lot of people. Maybe I'm just get lost in it all the time. It's a little confusing.
I love getting lost in it. I can imagine living in a building and walking down to that level and doing my shopping, taking my children, if they were young, to a daycare, living at that level.
But never going outside.
Oh, of course you'd go outside at a certain time, but it would just make life easy. You wouldn't need a car to go to.
I like the river walk in Calgary. I like the Calatrava Bridge. I think that the rivers are Alberta's and the prairie's best environments, and that's where I head. I mean, à chacun son goût.
There's a film of people who have a bet of the last person to go outside wins.
Way downtown.
Way downtown. And it doesn't sound, but to each
it's set in Calgary.
To each their own.
Yeah.
No, it's in Calgary.
It's similar, yeah, exactly.
Or Winnipeg, or there are cities that are essentially do privatize that public space. Just before we wrap, there is a municipal election here looming. If you were living in a city with a municipal election looming, what is the thing you would ask your, we have a chance in an election to demand something of our candidates. When it comes to building the city of the future, what is the question? Some candidate shows up at my door. What is the question I should ask that candidate to ensure that Vancouver is building a city of the future?
You've got so much going on. You've got so much going on in Vancouver. I'm envious in a lot of ways. You've got the green city thing. I mean, you've got an acceptance of transit here. In most cities, in my city, if that was the question, it would be like, what are you doing to limit traffic? What are you doing? What are your transit plans? Are you going to save or, do something about the overpasses that are now 50 or 60 years old and collapsing on people's heads? We've got a whole different set of problems out east. Your problems seem enviable to me in a lot of ways. I think Vancouver's big things, are social justice, environmental justice, that kind of thing. I think that this has become an incredibly unaffordable city. It's a city that I left for a number of reasons, but one of them is I could never imagine owning a house that I'd really, or a home or an apartment that I'd really like to have. I think my big question is, what are you doing to build a city that's really inclusive, that will provide space for young people, that can allow people to imagine building a family of any kind, of owning a place. Those are the big issues facing Vancouver in particular. And I think Trevor Boddy has talked about how this has become sort of a productive resort, a place where sort of urban or world capital goes to find a refuge. And when I come back, sometimes it feels too much like that. So I'd ask a candidate, what are you doing to build a truly inclusive city? And, are you offering alternatives in housing? Transit, you're doing okay, I think. I wouldn't press them too much on transit, because I think you've got that well on hand.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a kind of vision, a quick tour around the world, carbon-free, and showing us a little bit of the future. So please join me in thanking Taras Grescoe. Thank you.